Karen Deep Space Station floated at the edge of known space like a small metal city held together by old bolts and newer dreams. It was not the biggest station in the Galactic Cooperative. It was not the most beautiful, but it was the most important, because every species came here. Traders, soldiers, diplomats, workers, and families all walked the same wide corridors, breathed the same recycled air, and ate from the same long market rows that stretched for half a kilometer under pale yellow lights. The station had seen arguments before. It had seen fistfights, broken deals, and once, a very angry ambassador from the Dorath system who had thrown a bowl of protein soup at a trade official. But it had never seen anything like what happened on the morning of Cycle 7 inches, the station's 42nd year. The Vorkai arrived at Dock 9 with a delegation of 30. They were tall creatures, almost 2.5 meters each, with hard outer shells the color of dark stone, and 4 thin arms that ended in sharp, hooked fingers. Their eyes were flat and silver, and they moved in a tight group, like a wall of armor walking. They were here to discuss territorial rights over 3 star systems near the Outer Reach systems that several other species also claimed. The talks had been going badly for 2 cycles. The Vorkai did not like being told they could not have something. Executor Thrake Vel led the group. He was the senior official of the Vorkai delegation, and he carried himself like a creature who had never once been told the word no. He wore a long dark coat with silver markings that showed his rank, and he looked at every human he passed the way a person looks at something they are about to step on. The civilian quarter of Karen Station was always busy in the morning. Shops opened early. Food vendors set up their carts along the wide central corridor called the Promenade. Families moved through the space in slow, comfortable groups. And on that particular morning, 31 children from the Karen Station Elementary School were walking in a long, cheerful line toward the Stellar Observatory at the far end of the promenade. They were between 7 and 11 years old. Some of them held small notebooks. Some of them wore matching green jackets with the school name printed on the back. Their teacher, a quiet man named Mr. Addo, walked at the front of the line with a tired smile and a cup of coffee. 2 parent volunteers walked at the back. The children were loud, excited, and pointing at everything: the alien food stalls, the strange clothing of traders from distant systems, the big viewport windows that showed the stars hanging still and white in the black outside. Thrake Vel's delegation turned onto the promenade from the east corridor. The children's line was directly across their path. A station guide moved quickly to intercept the Vorkai group and explained politely that the corridor was temporarily slow due to the school group, and that if the delegation could wait just 2 minutes, the children would be passed and the way would be clear. Thrake Vel looked at the guide. He looked at the children. He said nothing. Then he nodded once to the enforcer unit at his side. 4 large Vorkai soldiers, carrying long weapons with wide barrel ends. The enforcers raised their weapons without any warning and fired a sonic dispersal blast directly into the promenade. The sound was not like any normal weapon. It did not boom or crack. It hit the air like a wall, and then expanded in every direction at once. It knocked adults off their feet. It shattered glass in 3 nearby shop fronts. It sent carts and goods and food flying across the corridor. And it hit the children. 14 of them were caught directly in the blast radius. They were thrown sideways, some into walls, some into each other. The noise alone was enough to cause bleeding in the ears. The force of the wave was enough to crack bones. 3 children were critically injured. 1 boy named Kofi had 2 broken ribs and a broken arm. Another child named Demi suffered a serious head wound, and a girl named Mara Ose, 8 years old, with small braids and a green school jacket, hit the back of her head against the corner of a metal bench and did not get up. The promenade went silent for 1 second. Then the screaming started. Station medical teams arrived in 4 minutes. The injured children were carried to the medical bay on level 6. Mr. Addo sat on the floor of the corridor with blood on his hands, not from any wound of his own, but from holding Mara's head still while they waited for the medics. He did not speak for a long time after. Thrake Vel and his delegation walked past the chaos and continued on their way to the conference rooms on level 3. He did not stop. He did not look back. By the evening of that same cycle, The news had reached every major human colony, station, and ship in the cooperative. The images were everywhere: the scattered green jackets, the broken glass, the small stretchers being carried through the station corridors. The name Mara Osei was on every human broadcast feed, next to the word critical. Other species watched. Some expressed concern. Some sent formal messages of sympathy. A few said nothing at all and waited to see what would happen next. The Vorkai response came 12 hours later, delivered by Thrak Vel himself, in a short official statement read to the press, assembled outside the conference hall. He stood straight, his silver eyes flat and completely without feeling. And he said the following words in a calm, even voice. The dispersal action was necessary to clear a blocked corridor during a high-priority diplomatic movement. Humans must learn to yield space when required. The young are simply taught this lesson earlier than others. We consider the matter closed. He walked back inside before any reporter could ask a question. The reaction across the human colonies was not loud. There were no riots, no burning buildings, no crowds in the streets. The human governments did not release any angry speeches. Human military channels did not issue any immediate statements. What happened instead was much quieter, and somehow, much more frightening. Across every human colony world, on ships and stations from one end of human space to the other, people stopped. They stopped what they were doing, and they looked at the image of Mara Osei in her medical bed, and they sat with it. Parents held their own children a little tighter. Soldiers who were off duty checked their gear without being told. Old veterans who had not thought about war in years sat down at their tables and were very still for a long time. The galaxy had seen humans angry before. Loud, expressive, passionate humans, waving signs and making speeches. This was different. This was the kind of quiet that only comes when something deep and very old inside a species wakes up, looks around, and begins to move. No one who knew humans well thought the silence was peace. It was not peace. It was the moment before. Director Yal Moro was not a tall woman. She was not a young woman either. She had gray at her temples and small lines around her eyes from years of reading documents in bad lighting. She had spent 22 years as the human representative to the Galactic Cooperative Assembly. And in those 22 years, she had sat through trade wars, border disputes, species-wide famines, and one incident involving the Dorath ambassador that she still refused to talk about. She had seen a great many things, but she had never walked into the assembly chamber feeling the way she felt on the morning after Mara Osei's name was put on every human broadcast feed in the galaxy. The Galactic Cooperative Assembly met on the station's upper level, in a round room with high ceilings and seating arranged in a wide circle so that no species sat above another. There were 44 species represented in the assembly. Some of them sent holograms, some of them sent physical delegates. The Vorkai sat in their usual section near the eastern wall, tall and still and dressed in dark colors, watching the room the way predators watch an open field. Thrak Vel was not present. He had sent a junior official in his place. The message was clear. This matter was not important enough for him to attend personally. Director Morrow walked to the central speaking floor. The room went quiet. Every eye, lens, sensor, and recording device in the chamber turned toward her. The junior Vorkai official leaned back slightly in his seat with the comfortable posture of a creature who expected nothing serious to happen. Director Morrow placed one item on the central broadcast table. It was a photograph. A simple, flat, printed photograph of Mara Osei lying in the medical bay on level 6 of Karen Station, surrounded by machines and wires, and the pale white light of a room built to keep small bodies alive. Her eyes were closed. Her green school jacket, the one with the school name on the back, was folded on the chair beside her bed. The photograph appeared on every screen in the assembly chamber. It appeared on the public broadcast feed that went out to 63 species across the cooperative network. It sat there in silence for 10 full seconds. Then Director Morrow spoke. Her voice did not shake. It did not rise. It was the voice of someone who has already made every decision that needs to be made and is simply informing others of the outcome. "We will not be filing a complaint," she said. She picked up the photograph, tucked it under her arm, turned around, and walked out of the chamber. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after she left. Then it broke into noise all at once: confusion, questions, some nervous laughter from corners of the room. The Vorkai junior official turned to his aide and said something in their own language. His aide wrote it down. The Sarathi ambassador, a tall, thin creature with large, dark eyes, who had watched humans for 30 years, did not laugh. She watched the door that Director Morrow had walked through and said nothing at all. The political analysts across the cooperative were quick to respond. Within hours, commentary was flooding the networks. Most of it said the same things in different words. Humans had no real response. Humans were backing down. The incident would be absorbed into bureaucratic procedure. The Vorkai had walked away clean, and this proved that humanity, for all its occasional noise, was ultimately toothless in a galaxy run by older and harder civilizations. The Vorkai state media ran a brief piece calling Director Morrow's exit a dignified retreat. The headline translated roughly to, "Humans, accept the natural order." None of them were watching the right things. While the analysts were talking, the human military communication grid went dark. Not broken dark. Deliberately and completely silent, which is an entirely different thing. Signals that had been broadcasting on standard frequencies for years simply stopped. Ships that were docked at 18 different stations across human space filed routine departure requests, received clearance, undocked, and then did not appear on any tracking system again. Their transponders were off. Their flight paths were not filed. They were simply gone, the way a hand disappears into a shadow. On Mars, 3 industrial manufacturing facilities received emergency production contracts signed at the highest level of human government. The contracts were not publicly disclosed. The facilities began running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers who asked what they were making were told simply that it was classified, and that the overtime pay would be very good. On Earth, in the Northern Hemisphere, in a city that most other species had never heard of, a building that had been dark for 11 years turned its lights on and stayed lit through the night. Volunteer enlistment across all human military branches jumped by 400% in 72 hours. Not draftees, not conscripts. Volunteers. People who showed up at recruitment offices before they were open, who waited in lines that stretched around corners, who brought their own paperwork already filled out. A 17-year-old boy on the colony of New Brisbane tried to enlist and was turned away because of his age. He came back the next morning with false documents. He was turned away again. He sat down on the steps outside the office and waited to see if the rules would change. Vorkai intelligence officers, whose job it was to monitor human activity, began noticing the gaps, the silences in data they had always been able to read. A senior intelligence analyst named Vreth So filed 6 reports in 2 days, each one more concerned than the last. His reports were reviewed by a committee, discussed briefly, and filed away. The committee's conclusion was that humans were doing what humans did, making noise, preparing a performance, building up to some dramatic gesture that would ultimately mean very little. One of the lower-ranked analysts in Vreth So's department, a young Vorkai named Keth Ara, who had spent 3 years specifically studying human behavioral patterns, did not agree with the committee's conclusion. She had been reading intercepted fragments of human communication, partial signals caught at the edges of the silence. She translated one recurring phrase that kept appearing across dozens of different human channels, on military frequencies, on personal messages between families, in what appeared to be automated system alerts, and she brought the translation to Executor Thrake Vel directly, bypassing the committee entirely. He was eating when she entered his office. He did not look up from his meal. She placed the translation on his desk. The phrase was short. 4 words. Not for territory. Not for resources. For the children. Thrakevel read it. He set it aside and went back to his meal. Humans are emotional, he said simply. Emotion is not strategy. Keth Ara stood in the doorway for a moment before she left. She did not sleep well that night. Or the night after. Across the galaxy, a handful of older species civilizations that had been watching the stars long enough to have seen this kind of quiet before began moving their assets quietly out of Vorkai-adjacent space. They did not announce why. They did not file any formal position changes. They simply, carefully, began not being where the Vorkai were. The Dorath moved 2 of their trade ships away from the Outer Reach border, without explanation. The Sarathi ambassador updated her personal emergency protocols for the first time in 6 years. And in the medical bay on level 6 of Karen Station, Mara Ose lay still in her bed, and the machines around her made their small, steady sounds, and her parents sat in the chairs beside her and held each other's hands. And outside the station's long windows, the stars were cold and white and very far away. The galaxy was waiting for humans to do something. It did not understand that humans had already started. Veth Kara was the heart of Vorkai military power. It was not their home world that was a colder, darker planet 3 systems away, but it was the world they had chosen to build their strength on, and over 300 years they had done exactly that. The planet had 6 orbital defense platforms, each one the size of a small moon. It had a fleet of 240 warships, stationed in the surrounding space, at all times. It had ground-based weapons systems that could reach targets in low orbit. Every approach vector was covered, every blind spot filled, every gap in coverage patched by redundant systems. Military analysts across the cooperative had studied Veth Kara for decades and reached the same conclusion every time. It was, for all practical purposes, unassailable. The Vorkai High Command had never seriously considered the possibility that anyone would try. Admiral Jonas Reeve had been in the human military for 41 years. He was 63 years old, short and lean, with a head of close-cropped white hair and a face that had not changed much in expression since his late 30s. People who had served under him described him in almost identical terms: quiet, methodical, completely without ego, and when the situation required it, absolutely without mercy. He had fought in 2 border conflicts and 1 full-scale war. He had never lost a single engagement he had personally commanded. He was also the father of 3 children and the grandfather of 2. One of his granddaughters was 7 years old. Her name was not Mara, but she had small braids, just like Mara Ose, and when he had seen the photograph on the broadcast feed, he had sat very still at his desk for a long time before he stood up, put on his uniform coat, and went to work. The UEF Retribution Fleet came out of faster-than-light travel at 0400 hours, Cooperative Standard Time, directly inside Vorkai sovereign space, not at the border, not at a neutral approach point. Inside, deep inside, in the space surrounding Veth Kara itself, between the planet and its 6 orbital defense platforms, 47 human warships dropped into real space in a precise geometric formation that had taken 3 days of calculations to design, filling every gap and blind spot in Vorkai coverage simultaneously. The Vorkai defense grid registered them and spent 4 full seconds trying to process what it was seeing. 4 seconds is not a long time by most standards. In space combat, 4 seconds is an enormous gift. Admiral Reeve used it. By the time the first Vorkai alarm systems were sounding across Veth Kara's orbital network, 3 of the 6 defense platforms had already been disabled, not destroyed, disabled their power cores, cut by precise strikes that had been planned down to the individual targeting second. The other 3 platforms were locked in a targeting triangle they could not break out of without firing on each other. The Vorkai fleet scrambled. 240 warships is an enormous number, and even surprised, they moved fast. The Vorkai were not poor fighters. They had been building and training their military for centuries, and whatever else could be said about them, they knew how to respond to a threat. The transmission from Admiral Reeve reached Vorkai High Command at 0407 hours, 7 minutes after the fleet's arrival. It was short, clear, and delivered in the flat tone of a man reading a list of items he needs from a supply store. This is Admiral Jonas Reeve, of the United Earth Federation Retribution Fleet. I am currently in control of your orbital approach space. My demands are as follows. Return all medical data and records for the 14 children injured at Karen Station. Surrender Executor Thrake Vel and the 4 Enforcer unit members responsible for the sonic dispersal attack. You have 1 hour to comply. There will be no further communication from my side until that hour is over. Then, he turned off the channel and watched his screens. The Vorkai response came in 11 minutes, not 60. It was not a surrender. It was their fleet opening fire. What happened next was recorded by every sensor array in the system, and studied afterward by military analysts from 31 different species. The full battle lasted 9 hours and 14 minutes. What made it remarkable was not the tactics, though the tactics were excellent. What made it remarkable was something much simpler and much harder to explain. Human ships did not behave the way Vorkai ships behaved. When a Vorkai warship took heavy damage, it pulled back. Not out of cowardice, it was simply rational military thinking. You withdraw, you repair, you return. Losing a ship to pure stubbornness serves no one. This was how every military in the cooperative operated, because it was logical, and every species in the cooperative valued logic highly. Human ships, when they took heavy damage, accelerated. A Vorkai cruiser disabled the engine stabilizers on the human destroyer Resolute in the 3rd hour of the battle. The Resolute lost 30% of its thrust capacity and half its shielding. By every standard military calculation, it should have broken off its attack run and moved to a support position. Instead, the Resolute increased its speed by 40%, pushed its remaining engines past their rated limit, and drove straight through the Vorkai cruiser's firing arc at a range so close that neither ship could use its main weapons without risking mutual destruction. The Resolute's captain used that dead zone to put every short-range weapon she had directly into the cruiser's unshielded port side. The Vorkai cruiser was crippled. The Resolute was badly damaged. Its crew fought on for 6 more hours. This pattern repeated itself across the entire battle. Human ships that were hurt did not stop. Human crews that took casualties did not slow down. Vorkai tacticians kept waiting for the moment when the humans would calculate their losses against their gains and decide the cost was too high. That moment never came. The humans had already done that calculation before the battle started, and they had decided that no cost was too high. Not for this. By the 6th hour, the Vorkai fleet had lost 61 ships. No human ship had been destroyed, though 11 were badly damaged, and 1, the Karen's Watch, named for the station where Mara had been hurt, was operating on emergency power with a crew of 43 doing the work of 200. By the 9th hour, the Vorkai command fleet was disabled and adrift. The orbital defense network was fully neutralized. Veth Kara was, for the first time in its 300-year history, completely open. Executor Thrakvel ordered a planet-wide broadcast at 1,321 hours. His voice on the recording was different from the voice that had given the statement after Karen, flatter, tighter, with something underneath it that had not been there before. He offered a ceasefire. He offered negotiations. He offered reparations. He used the word regrettable 3 times in reference to the incident at Karen Station, which was the closest thing to an apology that a Vorkai of his rank had ever publicly offered to any species in recorded history. Admiral Reeve received the broadcast on the bridge of his flagship, the Patient Reckoning. He listened to the whole thing without expression. When it was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, "The hour expired 8 hours ago." He turned back to his screens. His crew did not cheer. They were tired, and some of them were bleeding, and they had lost good people today, and none of it felt like something to cheer about. It felt like something that needed to be finished properly, and they were going to finish it properly, and then they were going to go home. On the bridge, behind the admiral, a young communications officer named Petty Officer Chen was quietly compiling the damage reports from across the fleet. At one point she stopped typing and just sat still for a moment, and the officer next to her asked if she was all right, and she said yes, she was fine. She was just thinking about a little girl in a medical bay. And then she went back to her work. The Vorkai, for the first time in their long and violent history, had run out of options. They had met something they did not understand, and they had fought it, and the thing had not stopped. Outside the wide bridge windows, Veth Kara turned slowly in the dark, its surface lit from below by city lights, and the human fleet held its position in the silence, and waited. The galaxy held its breath. This was not a figure of speech. Across the cooperative network, all other political business stopped. Trade negotiations were paused. Border disputes were tabled. The ongoing argument between the Dorath and the Milani over water rights in the Saiyan system, which had been dragging on for 8 years, was simply forgotten for a week. Every species was watching the same thing. 47 human warships sitting in orbit above Veth Kara, the Vorkai fleet disabled and adrift, the planet below completely defenseless. Everyone knew what came next. They had seen it before, from other species, in other wars. When one civilization completely defeated another, when the winner had the loser's homeworld open and unprotected below them, there was a pattern that followed. Resources were taken. Territory was claimed. The losing species was absorbed, reduced, or scattered. This was not cruelty. Most species had come to believe it was simply the logic of power. You build the strength to win. You win. And then you take what winning gives you. The Sarathi ambassador, whose name was Velasha, and who had watched more history unfold than most creatures alive, sat in her office on Cooperative Station and prepared the official Sarathi position on what was about to happen to the Vorkai. Her aide had drafted 3 different versions of the statement, depending on whether humans took partial control, full control, or simply destroyed the military infrastructure and left. All 3 drafts began with the same line. The Sarathi Collective recognizes the new reality of the outer reach. Velasha read all 3 drafts. Then she put them in a drawer and closed it. Something felt wrong, and she had been in this work long enough to trust that feeling. On Veth Kara, the civilian population waited in a state of fear, unlike anything the planet had known in living memory. The broadcast feeds showed the human ships in orbit, holding position, not moving, not firing. Military sirens that had been screaming since the battle ended were slowly being switched off, one by one, as the Vorkai defense forces stood down. People in the cities below watched the sky and waited for the bombs. The bombs did not come. What came instead were landing transports, small, fast, practical craft that descended from the fleet and touched down at 3 points around the capital city of Veth Kara, on cleared ground, away from civilian buildings. Human ground forces emerged in light tactical gear, moving in disciplined columns, and they did something that the watching population found deeply confusing. They stopped at the edge of the city, and they waited. A human officer sent a communication to the Vorkai civil administration, not the military, which no longer had meaningful command, but the civilian government, the offices that managed the city's food supply and water systems and transit. The message was short. It said that human forces were present, and that they had 3 objectives: locate and detain Executor Thrake Vel and the 4 members of the Enforcer Unit responsible for the Karen Station attack, secure all Vorkai military weapons, storage facilities, and ensure that civilian systems remained operational and undamaged. It said that any civilian who did not interfere with these 3 objectives had nothing to fear. It said that any civilian who was harmed by a human soldier in a way that was not directly necessary for these 3 objectives should report it immediately, because it would not be tolerated. The Vorkai civil administrator who received this message read it 4 times. Then she forwarded it to the city's population broadcast system, because she could not think of what else to do with it. Human forces moved through the city over the next 2 days. They were professional and they were careful and they were, in a way that the watching Vorkai population could not quite find a framework for, polite. When they moved through a market district, they moved around the stalls rather than through them. When they needed to pass through a residential building, they knocked. A group of Vorkai children who gathered to watch a column of human soldiers pass were not chased away. One of the soldiers, a big red-haired man who did not speak any Vorkai language, crouched down and showed them his sidearm, unloaded it, and let one of the children hold the empty weapon for a moment before he took it back, loaded it, holstered it, and walked on. The food supply chains, which had been disrupted by the battle's secondary effects, were restored by human logistics teams within 36 hours. The city's water treatment facility, which had suffered damage when a Vorkai military vehicle had crashed into its outer wall during the retreat, was repaired by a human engineering unit in less than a day. No one had asked them to fix it. They had simply seen that it was broken and fixed it. Weapons storage facilities were secured and sealed, their contents inventoried and locked. Military systems were disabled. But no civilian building was entered without permission. No civilian was detained without a specific stated reason. No property was taken. Thrakevel was found on the fourth day, in a private residence 40 kilometers outside the capital. He had not tried very hard to hide. Perhaps he had not believed this was really happening until it was too late to run effectively. He was arrested by 6 human soldiers and a human legal officer, who read him a formal list of charges in both standard cooperative language and Vorkai. The charges included criminal use of military force against unarmed civilians, criminal endangerment of minors, and deliberate obstruction of a neutral civilian corridor during an active diplomatic proceeding. The 4 members of the enforcer unit were arrested separately, each given the same formal reading of charges. Thrakevel said nothing during the arrest. But those present reported that when the legal officer finished reading the charges and the human soldiers began leading him toward the transport, the executor stopped walking for one moment and looked at the human legal officer with his flat silver eyes, and something moved in them, something that was not quite fear and not quite understanding, but was perhaps the very first stage of both. The tribunal was established on neutral ground, on a secondary station leased from the cooperative for the purpose. It operated under cooperative law, with 3 judges, 1 human, 1 Sarathi chosen as a neutral party, 1 Milani. The proceedings were broadcast publicly across the cooperative network. This is what frightened everyone. Not the fleet, not the battle, not the occupation of Vethkara, the trial. Because any species could understand a war. War was violence organized toward an outcome, and every civilization had done it. But what the watching galaxy saw over those 11 days of public tribunal was something different. It was humans being angry, genuinely, deeply angry. The kind of anger that had moved a fleet to cross the galaxy in silence and choosing, deliberately and carefully, not to let that anger make their decisions for them. Evidence was presented in order, methodically. Witnesses testified under oath and were cross-examined. Defense arguments were heard fully. Every step followed procedure, and the procedure was clearly designed not to punish the accused before a verdict, but to find the truth of what had happened and respond to it proportionately. Species across the cooperative watched this and felt, some of them, a complicated and unfamiliar emotion that none of them had a clean word for. It was something between respect and unease. It was the feeling of watching a creature that is significantly more dangerous than you believed, and realizing that the thing that makes it most dangerous is not its fleet, or its soldiers, or its weapons. It is the fact that it knows exactly how much force to use, and when to stop. Velasha, the Sarathi ambassador, watched the 7th day of the tribunal from her office, and then turned to her aide, a young creature, named Sori N, who was new to the work, and still surprised by things, and said, "The Vorkai feared their rage. I fear their restraint." Sorian asked what she meant. Velasha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A creature that acts only on rage can be predicted. It will destroy until it is satisfied, or until it is stopped. But a creature that feels full rage, and still chooses procedure, that creature decides how much justice is enough. And that means it can decide to give you very, very little of it, and call it fair." She paused. "Or it can decide to give you everything it is owed, every gram. And that, child, is a thing that should keep you awake at night." She turned back to the screen. On it, Executor Thrakevel sat in the tribunal hall, his silver eyes no longer flat, and the proceedings continued, careful and steady, toward their conclusion. The verdict came on the 11th day. Executor Thrakevel was found guilty on all 3 charges. The 4 members of the enforcer unit were each found guilty on 2 of the 3. The sentencing was delivered by the human judge, a calm woman named Judge Amara Solis, who read each sentence clearly and without drama. The enforcer unit members each received 15 years of supervised labor, assigned to infrastructure rebuilding projects in neutral cooperative space. Their service would be monitored by the Cooperative Council and could not be shortened by Vorkai government appeal. Thrakevel received 40 years. His assignment was specific, chosen deliberately, and the choice was made by director Yael Moro herself, who had sat in the gallery for the full 11 days of the tribunal and had said nothing and missed nothing. Thrakvel would spend his 40 years of supervised labor on Karen Deep Space Station. He would help rebuild the promenade section that had been damaged in the attack. He would help restore the shop fronts with their shattered glass. He would help repaint the walls and replace the broken bench with the sharp corner that had hurt Mara Osei. And when the rebuilding was done, he would move to maintenance work, and he would walk those same corridors every day for 40 years. And he would see the school groups that came through, and the families, and the children pointing at the stars through the wide viewport windows. Director Morrow had not chosen this sentence out of cruelty. She had chosen it because she believed in the part of her that had spent 22 years trying to build something better between species, that the worst punishment for a creature like Thrakvel was not pain. It was understanding. It was being made, day after day, for 40 years, to be in the presence of the thing he had dismissed. Ordinary life, ordinary families, ordinary children, until he could no longer find a way to look at it and feel nothing. Whether it would work, she did not know. She thought it might. She had seen stranger things. The Vorkai government's official response to the verdict was quiet. Quieter than anyone expected. There was no outrage, no threatening statement, no declaration of injustice. The new senior official, not Thrakvel, who was now a convicted criminal, but a younger Vorkai, named Executor Sev Ron, who had been watching the proceedings from her office with wide, very still, silver eyes, issued a single statement, acknowledging the verdict and confirming that the Vorkai government would cooperate with the cooperative oversight process. It was, by every measure, the most humble public statement a Vorkai government official had issued in the cooperative's entire history. Sevron had not issued it because she had been forced to. She had issued it because she had watched 11 days of proceedings and understood something that her predecessor had not. That the humans had given the Vorkai a gift by doing this properly. They could have simply destroyed things. They had chosen not to. They had chosen process and procedure and a verdict that could be called fair by any neutral observer. By accepting that verdict, Sevron gave her people a way forward that did not require endless war with a species that had just demonstrated it would cross the galaxy in silence for a group of hurt children. She was not soft. She was simply intelligent, in a way that Thrakvel had never bothered to be. The Vorkai military rebuilding agreement placed them under cooperative monitoring for 25 years. Their fleet would not be restored beyond defensive capacity without cooperative review. Their territory in the outer reach was reduced by 2 star systems, which were placed under neutral administration. Trade penalties were applied. It was not gentle, but it was measured, and it was proportionate, and it was, in the end, survivable. The galaxy began, slowly, to exhale. Other species had watched. They had all drawn conclusions. Some of those conclusions were about the power of the human military, which was real and significant, and would be discussed in strategy rooms across the cooperative for a generation. But the deeper conclusion, the one that the older, wiser observers kept coming back to, was about something harder to measure. The Dorath repositioned their assets back where they had been and filed a formal note of respect with the Human Diplomatic Office, which was a thing the Dorath had never done in their 800 years of cooperative membership. The Milani, who had been the neutral judge in the tribunal and had watched everything at close range, invited Director Morrow to speak at their annual gathering of senior officials. Morrow accepted. Her speech was short and mostly about trade routes, and the Milani found it slightly disappointing, but they applauded warmly anyway, because the invitation had never really been about the speech. The Sarathi Cultural Archive updated its entry on human civilization. The senior archivist, an ancient creature named Velmir, who had been writing these entries for longer than most species had been members of the cooperative, sat down at his desk and added the final line himself. He spent a long time thinking about what to write. He had written entries for species that were terrifying, species that were wise, species that were kind, species that were cruel. He had never written an entry quite like this one. He worked on the final line for an entire afternoon before he was satisfied with it. When he was done, it read, Do not misread their kindness as softness. Do not misread their silence as acceptance. And above all, do not touch their young. There is no version of that story where you win. He filed it, shut his desk lamp, and went home. On Karen Deep Space Station, Level 6, Medical Bay 3, on the 21st day after the attack, at 6:47 inches the morning by station time, Mara Osei opened her eyes. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden gasp, no movie moment. She simply came back the way people sometimes do, slowly, in pieces, like a light that flickers before it holds. Her mother was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her father standing at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He saw it first. He put down the coffee very carefully, as if sudden movements might undo what was happening, and he reached over and touched his wife's shoulder, and she woke up. Mara looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at her parents. Then she looked around the room. The machines, the soft lights, the chair with her folded green school jacket on it, with the slightly confused expression of someone who has been away for a while and is assessing what is different. "Did I miss anything interesting?" she said. Her voice was small and rough from disuse, but it was absolutely, completely, unmistakably hers. Her father made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but was entirely the sound of a man whose world had just reassembled itself. Her mother took her daughter's hand in both of hers and held it without speaking, and she was crying, but she was also smiling, and Mara looked at her with the patient puzzlement of an 8-year-old who does not fully understand why adults get so emotional about things. "Dad," Mara said after a moment, looking at her father's face. "Yeah, baby, your coffee's gonna get cold." He laughed. It came out loud and sudden, and he covered his mouth with his hand and laughed again into his palm. And his wife started laughing too, and Mara looked at both of them like they had lost their minds, which they had, briefly. And now we're finding them again. The doctor came in 20 minutes later, reviewed her readings, shone a small light in her eyes, asked her a series of questions that she answered with increasing impatience, and declared her recovery to be, in his professional medical opinion, extraordinary. He said this to her parents, in a very controlled tone, that did not quite hide the fact that he was also extremely relieved. The news spread through the station within the hour. The school class sent a video message that afternoon. 14 children, most of them in the same green jackets, crowded into a frame, all talking at once, until their teacher made them take turns. They told her about a science project that had been done. They told her that someone had brought a lizard to class, and it had escaped under the cabinets for a week. They told her she had missed a lot. She watched the video 3 times. Admiral Reeve was in his garden on Luna when the notification came through on his comm unit. He read it once, set the unit down on the garden wall, and went back to what he was doing. If anyone had been watching, they might have noticed that his movements for the rest of the afternoon were slightly lighter than usual, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. Director Morrow was in a meeting when her aide slipped her a handwritten note. She read it, folded it neatly in half, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to where her heart was, and she got back to the meeting. The meeting was about trade route adjustments in the Outer Reach, which was now under neutral administration, and there was a great deal to discuss. Somewhere on Karen Station, in a corridor that was being repainted and repaired, a construction supervisor ran a hand along a freshly patched section of wall and approved it with a nod. The work was good. The wall was solid. The sharp corner on the bench had been replaced with a rounded edge that could not hurt anyone. The promenade was almost finished. Soon the shop fronts would reopen. Soon the food vendors would come back with their carts and their smells and their noise. Soon the viewport windows would have their usual crowd of people pressing close to look at the stars. And one day, not too long from now, another school group would walk in a long, cheerful line down this same corridor, children pointing at everything, voices too loud, green jackets or blue ones, or whatever color this school used, moving toward the stellar observatory at the far end. And the galaxy, which had been watching, had learned something it would not soon forget. You could push humans, you could test them, you could make them angry, and they would go quiet. And the quiet was not peace. But if you hurt their children, If you looked at something small and bright and completely without threat, and decided that it was something you could harm without consequence, then you had made a decision you could not take back, because they would come. Quietly, completely, and prepared. And they would not stop until the thing was made right. That was all they wanted. Not empire, not domination, not revenge in the burning, endless sense of the word. Just for it to be made right. And they were very, very good at making things right.